Seville, the last days of October, 1596. A treasure fleet is coming into the harbor. It is heavy, it is on schedule, and every bar of silver on board has already been promised in writing to two brothers standing on the quay. They are not going to be paid a penny of it, because the contract they signed was a claim on a fleet that did not exist when they signed it. The ore was still inside a mountain in the Andes, 4,000 meters above the sea, and the men who would dig it out had not yet been told to walk there. Within weeks of that fleet docking, Philip II of Spain suspends payment. It is the fourth time he has done it in a reign of 42 years. Now go back and look at what those two men actually put their names to, because it is the whole of what I want to show you. 13th of July, 1595, Lisbon. Two brothers named Maluenda sit down with agents of the king. They will deliver 349,000 ducats in cash, in Lisbon, in 13 separate payments. And here's how the king will pay them back. 75,000 ducats from the General Treasury that November, 97,000 1 month after the arrival of the next treasure fleet from America, and the remaining 177,000 1 month after the arrival of the fleet of the following year. That last line is the whole mechanism of the Spanish Empire in a single clause. The repayment date is not a date. It is an event that has not happened yet on the other side of an ocean. And the brothers were not naive about it. The contract builds in what happens if the metal is late. If the fleet has not reached Seville by December of 1596, they may demand lifetime annuities instead, at a little over 7%. There are two further clauses, one permitting them to export the bullion out of Spain, and one protecting them if the king should debase his own coin. They thought of everything. They still lost. On that one contract, an expected return of 12.5% turned into a loss of 5%. And here is the detail that should stop you. This was not an exotic document. It is one of about 435 such contracts that survive in the Royal Archive at Simancas. It was an ordinary piece of business. So here's the question this video exists to answer. Potosi, the mountain that silver came from, was for about 50 years producing more than half the silver on the surface of the planet. How does the state that owns it suspend payment 4 times in 40 years? And I promise you the answer is not the one you have been given. It is not gold-hungry kings. It is not indolence. It is not a curse. The answer is written into the contract those brothers signed in a clause about a fleet that had not sailed. Let me put the thesis plainly, because it took me a while to get it right, and the version you will hear everywhere else is wrong. Potosi did not make Spain rich. It made Spain borrowable. The silver's real function in the imperial system was not income, it was collateral. The crown's slice of it was a tax, 20%, levied on metal that belonged to somebody else, and that tax was pledged to bankers in Genoa and Augsburg years in advance, against ships that had not left America. And the second half is stranger than the first. The solvency of the Spanish Empire never rested on America at all. It rested on a sales tax paid by Castilian farmers and shopkeepers. American silver was never more than 1/5 to 1/4 of royal revenue, even at its peak, and it was legally incapable of backing the crown's long-term debt. And I'm going to show you, at the end, a single row of numbers that ought to be famous, and is not, because it says the opposite of everything you have been told about what all this silver did to Europe. This is the history you were not taught. Now, to understand what the king was borrowing against, you have to go to the mountain. In 1545, somewhere on a steep slope in the Andes, a man grabbed a branch to haul himself up, and the branch came out by the root. In the hole it left, there was silver ore. That is where all of this starts. And almost everything you have been told about that moment is wrong, beginning with the llama. The best account we have was written 40 years later by a man who lived there. His name was Luis Capoche. He owned a refining mill at Potosi, and in 1585 he wrote a long report on the town for the Viceroy of Peru. The manuscript sits in the archive of the Indies in Seville. It is the single richest source on any mining town in the early modern world, and almost nobody uses it. You have probably heard the popular version, an Indian chasing a llama. A fire lit against the cold, and silver running molten out of the ground. Capoche tells it differently, and his version is better. The man's name was Gualpa, and he was from the Chumbivilca nation in the country around Cusco. He was hunting deer, not herding llamas, and the slope in those days still carried scrub and small trees, which is the only reason there was a branch there to grab at all. He took samples to Porco, the older silver mine nearby, and assayed them in a guaira, the Andean wind furnace. And then he did the sensible thing. He told nobody, and he worked the vein alone for 8 months. What gave him away was not geology, it was social observation. A neighbor at Porco, a man named Guanca, noticed that Gualpa was smelting ingots better than anything the district produced, and that, in Capoche's phrasing, his person had become better adorned because up until then he had lived in poverty. Guanca questioned him until he confessed. Gualpa gave him a second vein nearby to keep him quiet. It was no less rich, but it was harder rock, and Guanca could not work it. He asked to be let into the first vein. He was refused. So he went to the Spaniard he worked for and told him. The claim was registered on April 21st, 1545, and from that moment the mountain belongs to the empire. Understand what that mountain is. The summit stands at about 4,800 meters, close to 16,000 feet. The town that grew at its foot sits just over 4,000. Capoche describes it without any romance at all. Not a blade of grass grows on the mountain. Its color tends to dark red. Nothing edible grows in the town or near it, except a few potatoes and some barley that never makes grain, because the cold is perpetual. From May to August, winds the locals called tomahavis come in so cold and carrying so much dust and sand that they darken the air. Before the silver, nobody lived there at all. The climate was not survivable enough to be worth it. Now hold that picture and read the next line of the same report. Capoche notes that the residents dressed in velvet and pressed wool and fine stockings, and that it was rare to see breeches without brocade and gold thread, so common, he says, that artisans and mixed-race workmen dressed that way too. That is Potosi, the worst climate in the inhabited Andes and the best-dressed population in the Americas. Before Mercury arrived, the ore was smelted in those Andean wind furnaces, clay towers with vent holes, fired with llama dung and charcoal, and worked entirely by the wind, which is why they were set on the ridges and the high points around the town. Capoche counted them. In past years, he writes, the number of guairas reached 6,497. 6,500 fires burning at night on the mountainsides above the town. He describes it as a pleasant sight in the darkness, so many fires in the countryside, some set in lines along the points and pinnacles of the mountain like illuminations. That is what the richest place on earth looked like from a distance. And it looked like that because there was no other way to melt rock at 4,000 meters. In its peak year, 1592, Potosi refined something like 7 million ounces of silver. That is the number behind the claim I made a few minutes ago about half the silver on Earth. And the town grew to match. You will read everywhere that it held 160,000 people. Treat that carefully. No colonial census of Potosi survives, and that figure rests on a single estimate from 1611 whose breakdown includes 40,000 non-Spanish Europeans, which would make an Andean mining camp home to more foreigners than most. European capitals had... What the careful historians say is that it held more than 100,000 people by around 1600, and that it was the largest city in the Americas and the equal of most cities in Europe, which means it was almost certainly larger than Seville, the port that received its silver. And the name entered the language. In 1615, in the second part of Don Quixote, Cervantes has his knight haggling with Sancho over the price of a whipping, and Don Quixote says that if he had to pay what the service was really worth, the treasure of Venice and the mines of Potosi would not be enough. Not a place, a unit of the unpayable. Now, what did it cost to get the metal out? The answer is a labor system that lasted 240 years, and the reason it lasted has nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with a single number in an accounts book. I will give you that number in a moment. The system was designed by one man, Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, in the early 1570s, and it was called the Mita. 16 highland provinces, spanning more than 200 indigenous districts running from Potosi almost as far north as Cusco. 1 in 7 adult men aged 18 to 50 was liable each year. In 1578, the draft assigned just over 14,000 men. They did not commute. The obligation was to relocate. A man drafted from the shore of Lake Titicaca walked something like 480 kilometers to Potosi, and it took about 2 months, and he traveled with his family, his household goods, and his herds, because he was required to be resident for a year. The wages are in Capoche's report, and he gives them without comment. A drafted man was paid 3.5 reals a day. A free contracted worker, a minga, was paid 4. That difference does not look like much, but once you add in what the mine owner did not have to pay a drafted man for, a metayo cost about a third of what a free worker cost. That, and not ideology, is why the draft survived for 240 years. And here's the fact that undercuts the simple version of this story, and you should have it. The Mita was never the majority of the workforce. A report from 1603 counted 58,800 Indians working at Potosi, of whom 5,100 were conscripts. Fewer than 1 in 10. The rest were wage workers, many of them former conscripts who had never gone home. This is the argument Peter Bakewell made in 1984, and it stands, Potosi ran on a dual labor system, in which more or less free men worked alongside more or less coerced ones, and the free men were the larger group. That does not make what happened underground any better. It makes it stranger. Capoche describes the descent, and this is the passage to hold. The ore came up on ladders made of 3 strands of twisted cowhide, thick as cables, with rungs set between the strands so that one man could climb while another came down. Each ladder ran about 17 or 18 meters, and at the top of each there was a wooden platform to rest on, and then the next ladder. Each man carried something like 50 or 60 pounds of ore in a blanket, tied around his chest and slung over his shoulder. They climbed 3 at a time. Only the man in front carried a candle in one hand. The mines were absolutely dark, and the candle, Capoche says, gave little light and was quite often blown out by the wind inside the shaft. The climb was commonly 150 of those stages, in workings that ran to more than 400. And when they reached the surface, sweating, out of breath, and in his phrase, robbed of heat, the customary reception was to be called a dog and beaten, for bringing up too little ore, for taking too long, for bringing up dirt, for being suspected of stealing. Capoche reports one incident from 4 months before he wrote. A mine owner came at a worker with a stick. The man ran, not out of the mine, but deeper into it to get away, and in the dark he fell. Now I have to talk about the number, because you have heard it, and it is wrong. You will be told that Potosi consumed 8 million lives. That figure comes from a book published in 1971 by a Uruguayan journalist. It carries no source of any kind, and its author later distanced himself from the way he had worked. Here is what the counting supports. The historian, who has done the most careful work on the human cost of Andean mining, puts the deaths directly attributable to the silver and to the mercury across 2.5 centuries and the whole Andean system at well over 1 million. And here is the part that the big round number actually obscures, because it is worse. The Mita did not mainly empty the highlands by killing people, it emptied them by making people run. Men left their home villages so as not to be sent, and became registered outsiders somewhere else, which released them from the draft and cut them off from their land and their kin in the same act. By 1645, 37% of the indigenous population of the region were registered as outsiders or as attached laborers. By around 1690, the population of the districts subject to the draft stood at about 55% of what it had been when Toledo counted them in 1572. Half the people of an entire region gone from the rolls in 4 generations, some of them dead, and a great many of them simply somewhere else under another name. But none of that would have mattered to the King of Spain without one other substance, and this is where the mountain connects to the money. Silver ore at Potosi is not smelted. After the rich surface ores ran out, and they had largely run out by 1569, the metal has to be extracted chemically by grinding the ore and mixing it with mercury and salt. The technique was worked out in Mexico in the middle 1550s and adapted for Andean ore at Potosi, with successful trials in 1572. Toledo called the union of the mercury and the silver the greatest marriage in the world. And it was for him because mercury came from exactly 2 places in the entire Spanish Empire, Almaden in Spain and Huancavelica in Peru. Both were crown monopolies, which means the King of Spain had his hand on the throttle of his own silver supply. To know what Peru would produce next year, you did not look at the mines. You looked at how much mercury Huancavelica had shipped this year. The cost of that was borne somewhere else. About 1 7/10 pounds of mercury was lost for every pound of silver produced, essentially all of it, into the air and the water. Potosi got through something like 39,000 tons of it. And Huancavelica, where it came from, was called the Mina de la Muerte, the mine of death. The syndrome had its own name, the Huancavelica sickness, tremors that could not be controlled, weight loss, ulcerated mouths, failing lungs, and psychosis. Do not merge the 2 places because the numbers are not alike. Potosi was dangerous. Recorded deaths ran at around 50 men a year among tens of thousands. Huancavelica was lethal and may have killed as much as 1/3 of the adult male population of its own draft region. The silver mine has the reputation. The mercury mine did the killing. So the metal is out of the ground. Now follow it, because this is where almost every account of the Spanish Empire goes wrong. The mines were privately owned. The King of Spain did not own the silver of Potosi. He taxed it. The tax was the quinto real, the royal fifth, a flat 20%, levied on all remittances at the customs house in Seville. It stayed at 20% until 1736, when it was cut to 1/10 because the ore had got so poor that the higher rate was killing production. So the crown's stake in the richest mine in the history of the world was 1/5 of somebody else's metal. And at the very peak of the flow, at the end of the 16th century, silver taxes were about 1 ducat in 4 of royal revenue. Some historians put it lower, at a fifth. Nobody serious puts it higher. Now here's the detail that changes the whole shape of the story, and it is a legal one. The crown's long-term debt, the juros, perpetual annuities held by convents, widows, city corporations, and Genoese bankers alike, could only be secured on what was called ordinary revenue. Ordinary revenue meant taxes approved by the Cortes, the assembly of 18 Castilian cities. American silver was not ordinary revenue. It could not be pledged to a bondholder. It was not eligible. Ordinary revenues averaged only about 55% of the crown's income, and crucially did not include silver at all. The taxes that required the consent of those 18 cities were, on their own, 43% of royal revenue across the second half of the century. Read that again. The Spanish Empire, the Armada, the Army of Flanders, the Escorial, the wars against the Dutch, the French, and the Turk was financed principally by a sales tax paid by Castilian farmers and shopkeepers collected with the grudging permission of 18 town councils. The silver was the volatile part. It arrived when it arrived, in amounts nobody could predict, and it was the largest single component of the king's free cash. And this is precisely why it got mortgaged. You pledge the stable money to the bondholder because he needs certainty, and you pledge the unpredictable money to the short-term lender because he will price the risk and lend against it anyway. That is not a scandal. It is the correct thing to do with a windfall. It is also how you lose control of it. So now we come back to that contract in Lisbon, and to the promise I made you at the start of this video that the answer was written into it. Here is the answer. The instrument was called an asiento, and an asiento was not really a loan at all. It was a delivery contract. Understand the problem it solved. The king's money arrives in Seville in bars in October in a year when the fleet is not late. The king's army is in Flanders, and it needs to be paid in the coin of the Low Countries in March, or it will mutiny. There is no mechanism inside the Spanish state that can turn the first thing into the second thing. So the king rents one. A banker undertakes to put a specified sum in a specified currency in a specified city, Antwerp, Milan, Genoa, Lisbon, on a specified date. In return, he is repaid in Castile, later, out of revenue named in the contract. The stated interest looks tolerable, usually around 9% before 1570, 12 by 1575, 16 by the end of the century. The real cost was not in the stated rate. When historians reconstructed what these contracts actually returned, the median gross return was about 14%, and a great many ran above 20% because the profit was buried in the exchange rate applied in advances the king made, without interest, in swaps of bonds at favorable prices, and in lifetime pensions granted to the banker's family. The single biggest driver was geography. A contract with a foreign exchange clause, that is, one requiring delivery abroad, cost the king 6 to 9 percentage points more than one without. That is the price of the Spanish state's inability to move its own money. 6 to 9 points every time for a century. And now the three clauses, because a pair of economists went through every asiento signed between 1570 and 1575 and found the same architecture in almost all of them. The first clause is a license exempting the banker from Castilian usury law, so that he can go and raise money on the credit market. The second is called tomar a cambio, to take on exchange. It says the banker will raise the funds in the market rather than supply them himself. In 1570, 88% of all Asiento volume carried that clause. Hold that because it demolishes the standard version of this story. The Genoese were not shipping in chests of their own gold. They were overwhelmingly intermediating Castilian savings, taking money from Castilian depositors and lending it to the Castilian king, and charging for the transfer. And the third clause is the one that matters most. It is a license to anticipate, to take the royal payment orders and discount them on the credit market, which means the claim on a fleet that had not sailed was itself a security. It circulated. It changed hands. Somebody in Medina del Campo held a piece of paper whose value depended on ore still inside a mountain in the Andes, and he could sell it to somebody else. The silver was sold forward, repeatedly, before it existed. Here is what that bought. On February 1st, 1572, a banker named Lorenzo Spinola contracted to deliver 120,000 ducats in Madrid, and the contract states the purpose. The money is for the construction of the Escorial. The document names the revenues that will repay it. It cannot name the dates, because those revenues are coming from a fleet. Philip II built the Escorial with silver that had not yet crossed the Atlantic. And on the 22nd of December, 1574, a banker called Pablo de Grimaldo signed for 830,000 ducats in cash in Madrid, in 3 installments at a fixed 16%, with total repayments capped over 7 years, at just over 1,600,000, nearly double back. That contract alone was about a sixth of a peak year's borrowing. It was signed 8 months before the crash. Where did this money come from? From a set of exchange fairs run by Genoese financiers, created in 1535 at Besançon, moved around, and finally fixed at Piacenza in 1579. They met 4 times a year, they cleared bills on a 3-month cycle, and they did their accounting in a unit that existed nowhere on Earth as a coin. The Spanish Empire was funded through a synthetic currency at a quarterly clearinghouse in northern Italy in the 16th century. So let us talk about the bankruptcies, because the popular version of them is nonsense, and the true version is worse. Philip II suspended payments 4 times, 1557, 1560, 1575, and late in 1596. 4 times in a reign of 42 years. And here's the first correction, and it is a big one. He never defaulted on the euros. Not once. The long-term bonds, the ones held by the widows and the convents and the city corporations, were serviced without interruption through every one of those suspensions. Not always in full when the tax stream they were secured on came in light, but never rescheduled and never stopped. What was suspended was the short-term banker debt, and that debt was about a quarter of the total debt stock in 1575, and under a tenth by 1596. So Spain went bankrupt describes a payment stop on a minority slice of the borrowing, aimed at a specific group of creditors, while the rest kept being paid. Take 1575, the big one. The decree comes down on the 1st of September and suspends about 14.5 million ducats, roughly 2 years of royal revenue. Then the negotiation. The settlement is signed on December 5th, 1577. On average, the king repays 62% of the accumulated debt, and the bankers immediately advance him a new loan of 5 million ducats. Lending restarts the following year. Look at how the losses fall, because it tells you exactly what these men were pricing. Bankers who held standard bonds as collateral recovered 70%. Bankers holding bonds secured on the customs house recovered 55%. Bankers with no collateral at all recovered 42%. That is not a robbery. That is a restructuring, and the recovery rates track the security exactly as they would today. The 4th suspension is settled in under a year with a flat 20% haircut. And now the number that ought to end the popular version of this story for good. Across 435 contracts after both bankruptcies, the bankers' actual realized return on lending to Philip II was 15.5% a year, against about 7% available on the safe long-term bonds. Of the 60 families who risked capital, 5 lost money. Their combined losses came to just over 75,000 ducats, less than 0.1% of all the short-term lending of the reign. The Maluenda brothers, the ones from the cold open, lost on the contract of 1595. Across their whole relationship with the crown, they lent 4.33 million ducats and made 20.5%. Philip II was not a deadbeat. He was a demanding client who paid a very high rate and occasionally rescheduled, and lending to him was, on the whole, the best business in Europe. And I should tell you that the historians are still fighting about this. One camp argues the payment stops were liquidity crises, that the debts were fundamentally sustainable, that primary surpluses averaged over 30% of revenue, and that at the king's death, the debt-to-revenue ratio stood almost exactly, where it had 33 years earlier. Another camp argues the 1575 stop was nothing of the kind, that it was a weapon, aimed not at the bankers at all, but at those 18 cities of the Cortes who were refusing to approve new taxes. Freeze the Genoese, let the pain travel down to their Castilian depositors, and the towns will fold. They have been going at each other in the journals for a decade, and I am not going to pretend it is settled. But notice what the second camp is describing. It says the pain was supposed to travel downwards into Castile. So if the bankers did fine, who paid? Castile paid. When the decree came down in September 1575, the shock ran straight down the pyramid of credit. Because of that second clause, the Genoese had raised the money from Castilian depositors. When the king stopped paying the Genoese stopped paying Castile. There was no fair at Medina del Campo, the clearinghouse of the entire Castilian economy, from September 1575 until the beginning of 1578. In Segovia, in October 1575, 40 men were jailed over the collapse of a single bank. The record describes them as all being principal people of the town. In Seville, the following year, 2 banks that had been trading since 1553 went under. The merchants of Logroño wrote to the Council of Finance in April 1576 that the craftsmen, ordinary people, employees, and day laborers who had lived on the business that depended on credit were now homeless and vagabonds. And a widow in Burgos named Doña Francisca de Salazar, who had lent 606 ducats and could not get them back, wrote a sentence I would put on the screen and leave there. We have completely lost the credit, which is the nerves, the soul, and the strength of commerce. And here's the detail that tells you where the state's loyalties actually sat. The crown gave the Genoese bankers legal protection against their own Castilian creditors. So a merchant of Burgos named Andres de Larrea went to prison over a debt of 16,000 ducats that he could not pay, while he was unable to recover 25,000 ducats he had himself lent to a Genoese banker at the last fair at Medina del Campo, money which in his own words had been converted to the service of His Majesty. That is the transaction in one man. The suspension was not a default on foreigners. It was a transfer from Castilian savers to the war, run through foreign intermediaries who were shielded while it happened. Now, where did all that metal actually end up? Not in Spain, not most of it, and not for long. And I want you to hold on to why this matters, because it is what makes the last third of this story more than a travelogue. The silver arrived. In roughly 3 centuries of treasure fleets, only one was ever captured whole. Storms took more than enemies did. Year after year, decade after decade, the ships came in. It arrived and Spain suspended payment anyway. Which means the interesting question was never what Spain lost. It is what Spain bought. In 1571, the Spanish founded Manila and the last link of the world market closed. From then until 1815, a galleon ran once a year from Acapulco to Manila, carrying silver west across the Pacific. Why silver? Because of a price difference, and it is the cleanest arbitrage in economic history. In Canton, at the end of the 16th century, an ounce of gold bought about 6 ounces of silver. In Spain, it bought 12 to 14. Silver was worth roughly twice as much in China as it was in Europe. And that was not an accident of taste. China had abandoned paper money, and in the 1570s, the Ming reformed the tax system so that taxes had to be paid in silver, in an economy holding perhaps a quarter of the human race. A Portuguese historian called China a suction pump, and that is exactly right. The volumes are contested, and I will give you the range honestly. The conservative estimate is at least 50 tons of silver a year crossing the Pacific through the 17th century. And here's the comparison that makes it land. 50 tons a year was also roughly what Portugal, the Dutch East India Company, and the English East India Company shipped to Asia combined. Manila, by the middle of that century, had 42,000 people, and 70% of them were Chinese. And I want to flag something here, because it is the sequel almost nobody tells. All this silver draining east into China is the trade imbalance that Britain will spend the whole of the 19th century trying to reverse. Opium was how they did it. There is a video on this channel about exactly that, and it starts where this section ends. The coin itself became the first global currency. The piece of 8 reals, about 25.5 grams of fine silver, circulated in China, in the Ottoman lands, in Mughal India, and in colonial North America. Chinese money changers punched their own marks into them, certifying that a named merchant had tested that particular disc. When the United States defined its own dollar in 1792, it did so at 371.25 grains of fine silver, a figure arrived at by assaying-worn Spanish coins in circulation. The American dollar is a measurement of a Potosi coin, and Spanish silver stayed legal tender in the United States until 1857 because the Americans did not have enough of their own coin to replace it. One quick correction while we are here, because it comes up every time. You have been told that the dollar sign comes from the 2 pillars on the back of the Spanish coin, with the ribbon wound round them. It is a lovely story, and it is probably not true. It first appears in letters to a magazine in the 1870s. The derivation with actual manuscript evidence behind it is duller and better. The sign is a contraction of the abbreviation for peso, a P with a small s written above it, collapsing into a single mark in the ledgers of merchants who wrote it 10,000 times. The symbol of global money is the handwriting of a tired clerk. And then there is the other direction the silver went, which is north. About 150 tons a year moved through Europe into Asia, the Baltic trade with Russia and Poland. Lithuania absorbed something like 50 tons a year on its own. And the country that ran the clearing, that arranged the settlements and shipped the metal, was the Dutch Republic, which was at that moment in open revolt against the King of Spain. It gets worse. From 1548, foreign cloth entered Spain duty-free. Spain remained a net importer of cloth until the 19th century. The silver came in through Seville and went straight back out to pay for textiles made by the people Spain was fighting. Occasionally, the Dutch simply took it direct. In 1628, in the Bay of Matanzas off Cuba, an admiral of the Dutch West India Company named Piet Hein intercepted 16 Spanish ships and captured the entire treasure fleet without a shot being fired. The Spanish ran their vessels aground and fled. The haul was about 11.5 million guilders, roughly half the annual budget of the Dutch Republic. The shareholders took a 50% dividend. The proceeds paid the Dutch army for 8 months and funded the siege that took 's Hertogenbosch the following year. And that was the only time it ever happened. I told you at the start of this section that in 3 centuries only one fleet was taken whole. That was it. Every pirate story you have ever heard about Spanish treasure is built, substantially, on one afternoon in a Cuban bay. Storms sank far more silver than enemies ever took. A hurricane in 1622 sank 7 ships off the Florida Keys in a single night. And now the last act, which happens at the Mint, and which I think is the best kept secret in this entire story. By the 1640s, Potosi is in trouble. The ore is poorer, the shafts are longer, the indigenous population has collapsed, and labor costs have risen. The refiners and the merchants who finance them are drowning in debt. So they debase the king's coin. The historian who reconstructed this calls it an illegal form of financial innovation, and that is exactly what it was. They were not thieves in the ordinary sense. They were insolvent men counterfeiting their way out of a solvency crisis at the Mint, using the king's own dies. A royal decree of December 1642 specified 93 parts of silver in 100. Assays later found Potosi coins carrying 75. Complaints out of Aragon and Castile in 1648 claimed some coins held the silver of 5 reals while stamped as 8. And the concealment mechanism is the darkest thing in this film. The Mint's workshops were worked by enslaved Africans, and they were the hands that did the adulterating. That is what made an industrial fraud survivable for a decade, not clever accounting, but a workforce with no standing to accuse anybody of anything. And when the fraud finally broke, the defense offered by the men who had run it was to blame those workers for stealing the silver themselves. That is the historian's central finding about this case, and I want to be exact about it. The fraud lasted as long as it did because there was a category of person available to be blamed.
So how was it caught? Not by Madrid, by the customers.
Because the coin was global, the fraud was detected globally. Money changers in Canton and merchants in the Middle East were spotting underweight Potosi coins in the 1620s. Debased Potosi pieces were identified in Genoa and in Antwerp in 1641. By the early 1640s, they were being routinely rejected in the spice ports of India and Southeast Asia, and Mughal India was melting millions of suspect coins down into rupees. The world knew before the king did. Madrid's first investigator was sent in 1642 and removed almost at once under pressure from the local factions. A second attempt in 1645 was frustrated, apparently with the connivance of the Viceroy of Peru, who was also protecting the ringleader and supporting his application for a knighthood. It took until 1648 and formal complaints from the Cortes of Aragon and Castile before Philip IV sent a man who could not be bought, Francisco de Nestares Marin, a Navarrese former inquisitor. He reached Potosi on December 11th of December 1648, and the enslaved workers of the Mint gave testimony in his investigation. The people the fraud had counted on to be permanently blamable turn up in the record as witnesses to it. The ringleader was Francisco Gomez de la Rocha, a silver merchant who had started out selling coca. He was offered a settlement and refused it. He tried to have Nestares poisoned. Then he took sanctuary in the Franciscan monastery, and Nestares sent armed men in and dragged him out of the church, which was at the time close to a scandal in itself. He was garroted on the 25th of January, 1650, and his body was hung in the main square of Potosi the following day. The chief assayer, whose initial appears on the debased coins, was executed in February. And then, this detail, which I love. The new chief assayer sent from Spain needed a mark to stamp on the coins. The obvious letter was now the initial of a convicted man, so he chose a wheel, a pun on his own surname, rather than reuse it. A letter had to be retired from the currency. In January 1652, the bad coins were formally devalued. An 8-real piece was to circulate at 6, then be melted. In March, the new design appeared, the one with the 2 pillars and the 2 globes. It did not fully work. Merchants went on discounting Potosi silver for years. And there is a line recorded from the traders of the period that is the epitaph for the whole thing, that even after the reform, the P mint mark of Potosi was read as standing for poison. Now, I want to be careful here because there are 3 ways this story gets told badly, and I have been guilty of one of them. The first is the conspiracy version, foreign bankers bleeding Spain dry. It is the oldest shape in this genre, and on this evidence, it is simply wrong. 88% of the lending in 1570 carried a clause stating that the banker was raising the money on the market, meaning the money was largely Castilian to begin with. The Genoese were not a hidden hand. They were a payment system, and they were expensive because the service was hard. The villain here is a mechanism, a state that could not get its own money to its own army in time and paid 6 to 9 points a year, for a century to men who could. That is not a conspiracy. That is a fee. The second is the atrocity number, which I have already dealt with, but let me say why I bothered. 8 million is not a finding, it is a slogan. Using it does not honor anybody. It just makes the real thing, a highland emptied as much by flight as by death, easier for the next person to wave away. And the third is the one I nearly opened this video with. Spain never saw the silver, it is a great line, and it is false. Seville became the largest city in Spain. The Spanish money supply in silver rose more than tenfold. On the best modern reconstruction, Spanish income per head around 1600 was roughly 30% higher than it would have been with no treasure at all. The silver was there. What is true is narrower and stranger. The crown's share of it was a tax on other people's metal. It was pledged before it arrived, and a very large part of the rest left again within a few years for Amsterdam, Antwerp, Surat, and Canton. And even the long-run verdict is contested. One team, using modern statistical methods, estimates that by 1750, Spanish income per head was more than 40% below where it would have been without the treasure, a boom of a century followed by 2 centuries of relative decline. Another historian argues the silver is a red herring entirely, and that the real culprit was a country so jurisdictionally fragmented that goods could not move inside it. I will give you both, because both are serious. Anyone who hands you only one of them has quietly done your thinking for you. So what is this really about? It is about the difference between a resource and a revenue. Potosi produced money. It never produced an economy. A city of over 100,000 people, 4,000 meters up, that imported its food, its timber, its iron, its cloth, its wine, and its mercury, and exported exactly one thing. Capoche noticed the pathology in 1585, and his sentence is devastating. The buildings, he says, are the worst to be found in these parts, because the residents are itinerant traders who come and go with no fixed abode, and to whom the public good and the improvement of towns matters little. 100,000 people, in the richest place on earth, who never bothered to build the town they were standing in. And now the fact that ought to be famous and is not. Across the 16th century and into the 17th, prices in Spain rose by a factor of about 4.5. In southern England, they rose about 7-fold. In Brabant, more than 8-fold. The country where the metal landed had the mildest inflation of the three. Prices in Europe had begun climbing around 1516, decades before the American imports mattered, driven by a silver mining boom in southern Germany, by the spread of negotiable credit, and by a growing population. The American silver poured fuel on a fire that was already burning, and it did most of its burning somewhere other than Spain, because it did not stay. One last measurement, and then I will leave you alone. A historian looking for why Spain fell behind went and priced salt cod, dried Atlantic cod, the staple protein of the whole country, shipped in from the north. And what she found is that the price gaps between Spanish towns were essentially uncorrelated with the distance between them. Cod could be dearer in a port where the ships physically arrived than in a town in the middle of the country. Distance cannot explain that. Roads cannot explain that. Only borders inside a country can. Toll after toll, exemption after exemption, jurisdiction after jurisdiction. Spain, in this period, is not one economy. It is a set of economies that happen to share a king, and the king is at Piacenza borrowing at 16% against a fleet. And the trade the Spanish crown made is the one every resource state has made since. This channel has told it twice already in different metal, once in southern Africa, where the selling price of gold was fixed by law, so the only variable left was the wage, and once with a barrel of oil in place of a mountain. It is always the same shape. You are handed a windfall whose price you do not set, whose quantity you cannot predict, and whose arrival date you do not control. And because it is large, you borrow against it. And the moment you have borrowed against it, you no longer own it. You work for it. Go back to Lisbon one last time. Two brothers advance 1/3 ducats against a fleet that has not been loaded, in a port that is not Spanish, to a king whose army is in another country, and whose taxes are voted by 18 towns that do not want to pay them. Everyone in that room knows the metal exists. Nobody knows when it will arrive, or what it will be worth when it does, or whether the man they are lending to will still be paying by then. That is not wealth. That is a position, and a position can be closed against you. The mountain is still there. It has been mined continuously for 480 years. Men still go into it every morning, and the ore is worse than it has ever been. If you made it this far, drop a silver coin in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. And tell me where you land on this, because I genuinely go back and forth. Was Philip II a bad debtor? His bankers made 15.5%, and 5 families out of 60 ever lost money. He never missed a payment on a bond held by a convent or a widow. By the standards of sovereign borrowers, he was arguably a good one. And a widow in Burgos lost 600 ducats and wrote that the soul of commerce had gone out of the country.
Both of those are true about the same decree. So who was that default actually against? I read every one of them.
If this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, subscribe. It genuinely helps these keep coming. I'll see you in the next one.